r/askreddit, posted by Reddit user NG96. What is your favorite creepypasta? Mine was about a hunter in the woods who, after a long day hunting, was in the middle of an immense forest. It was getting dark, and having lost his bearings, he decided to head in one direction until he was clear of the increasingly impressive foliage. After what seemed like hours, he came across a cabin in the small clearing. Realizing how dark it had grown, he decided to see if anyone would let him stay there for the night. He approached and found the door ajar. Nobody was inside. The hunter flopped down on one of the single beds, deciding to explain himself to the owner in the morning. As he looked around in the inside of the cabin, he was surprised to see the walls adorned by several portraits, all painted in incredible detail. Without exception, they appeared to be staring down at him, their features twisted into looks of hatred and malice. Staring back, he grew increasingly uncomfortable, making a concerted effort to ignore the many hateful faces. He turned to face the wall and, exhausted, fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, the hunter awoke. He turned, blinking in the unexpected sunlight. Looking up, he discovered that the cabin had no portraits, only windows. During the summer of 1983, in a quiet town near Minneapolis, Minnesota, the charred body of a woman was found inside a kitchen stove of a small farmhouse. A video camera was also found in the kitchen, standing on a tripod, pointing at the oven. No tape was found inside the camera at the time. Although the scene was originally labeled as a homicide by the police, an unmarked VHS tape was later discovered at the bottom of the farm well, which had apparently dried up earlier that year. Despite its worn condition and the fact that it contained no audio, police were still able to view the contents of the tape. It depicted a woman recording herself in front of a video camera, seemingly using the same camera the police had found in the kitchen. After positioning the camera to include both her and her kitchen stove in the image, the tape then showed her turning on the oven, opening the door, crawling inside, and then closing the door behind her. 8 minutes into the video, the oven could be seen shaking violently, at which point, thick black smoke could be seen emerging from it. For the remaining 45 minutes of the video, until the batteries in the camera died, it remained in a stationary position. To avoid disturbing the local community, the police never released any information about the tape, or even the fact that it was found. Police were also not able to determine who put the tape in the well, nor could they explain why the skeleton pulled from the oven was out of completely different height and stature than the woman in the video. A man went to a hotel and walked up to the front desk to check in. The woman at the desk gave him his key and told him on the way to his room there was a door with no number on it that was locked and no one was allowed in there. Especially no one should look inside the room under any circumstances. So he followed the instructions of the woman at the front desk, going straight to his room and going to bed. The next night, his curiosity would not leave him alone about the room with no number on the door. He walked down the hall to the door and tried the handle. Sure enough, it was locked. He bent down and looked through the wide keyhole. Cold air passed through it, chilling his eye. What he saw was a hotel bedroom, like his. In the corner was a woman whose skin was completely white. She was leaning her head against the wall, facing away from the door. He stared in confusion for a while. He almost knocked on the door out of curiosity, but decided not to. This disinclination saved his life. He crept away from the door and walked back to his room. The next day, he returned to the door and looked through the wide keyhole. This time, all he saw was redness. He couldn't make anything out except the distinct red color unmoving. Perhaps the inhabitants of the room knew he was spying the night before and blocked the keyhole with something red. At this point, he decided to consult with the woman at the front desk for more information. She sighed and said, "Did you look through the keyhole?" The man told her that he had, and she said, "Well, I might as well tell you the story. A long time ago, a man murdered his wife in that room, and now her ghost haunts it. But these people were not ordinary. They were all wide over except for their eyes, which were red." In 1983, a team of deeply pious scientists conducted a radical experiment in an undisclosed facility. The scientists had theorized that a human without access to any senses or way to perceive a stimuli would be able to perceive the senses of God. Video of these experiments can be found. They believed that the five senses clouded the awareness of eternity, and without them, a human could actually establish contact with God by thought. An elderly man who claimed to have nothing left to live for was the only test subject to volunteer. To purge him of his senses, the scientists performed a complex operation in which every sensory nerve connection was surgically severed from the brain. Although the test subject retained full muscular function, he could not see, hear, taste, smell, or feel. With no possible way to communicate or with even senses out of the outside world, he was alone in his thoughts. Scientists monitored him as he spoke aloud about his state of mind in jumbled, slurred sentences that he couldn't even hear. After 4 days, the man claimed to be hearing hushed, unintelligible voices in his head. Assuming it was onset of psychosis, the scientists paid little attention to the man's concerns. 2 days later, the man cried that he could hear his dead wife speaking with him, and even more, he could communicate back. The scientists were intrigued, but were not convinced until the subject started naming dead relatives of the scientist. He repeated personal information of the scientist that only their dead spouses and parents would have known. At this point, a sizable portion of scientists left the study. After a week of conversing with the deceased through his thoughts, the subject became distressed, saying the voices were overwhelming. In every waking moment, his consciousness was bombarded by hundreds of voices that refused to leave him alone. He frequently threw himself against the wall, trying to elicit the pain response. He begged scientists for the sedatives, so he could escape the voices by sleeping. This tactic worked for 3 days, until he started having severe night terrors. The subject repeatedly said that he could see and hear the deceased in his dreams. Only a day later, the subject began to scream and claw at his non-functional eyes, hoping to sense something in the physical world. The hysterical subject now said the voices of the dead were deafening and hostile, speaking of hell and the end of the world. At one point he yelled, "No heaven, no forgiveness," for 5 hours straight. He continually begged to be killed, but the scientists were convinced that he was close to establishing contact with God. After another day, the subject could no longer form coherent sentences. Seemingly mad, he started to bite off chunks of flesh from his arm. The scientists rushed into the test chamber and restrained him to the table so that he could not kill himself. After a few hours of being tied down, the subject halted the struggle and screaming. He stared blankly at the ceiling as teardrops silently streaked across his face. For 2 weeks, the subject had to be manually rehydrated due to the constant crying. Eventually, he turned his head and, despite his blindness, made focused eye contact with a scientist for the first time in the study. He whispered, "I've spoken with God, and He has abandoned us." And his vital signs stopped. There was no apparent cause of death. For me, it's gotta be that missing episode of The Simpsons called Dead Bart. The episode was about the Simpsons going on a plane trip. Near the end of the first act, the plane was taking off. Bart was fooling around as you'd expect. However, as the plane was about 50 feet off the ground, Bart broke a window on the plane and was sucked out. Act 1 ended with a shot of Bart's corpse. When Act 2 started, Homer, Marge, and Lisa were sitting at their table crying. The crying went on and got more and more pained and sounded more realistic. Better acting than you would possibly think. The animation started to decay even more as they cried, and you can hear murmuring in the background. The characters could barely be made out. They were stretching and blurring. They looked like deformed shadows with random bright colors thrown on them. There were faces looking in the window, flashing in and out so you were never sure what they looked like. This crying went on for all of Act 2. Act 3 opened with a title card saying 1 year had passed. Homer, Marge, and Lisa were skeletally thin and still sitting at the table. There was no sign of Maggie or the pets. They decided to visit Bart's grave. Springfield was completely deserted. As they walked to the cemetery, the houses became more and more decrepit. They all look abandoned. When they got to the grave, Bart's body was just lying in front of the tombstone, looking just as it did at the end of Act 1. The family started crying again. Eventually they stopped and just stared at Bart's body. The camera zoomed in on Homer's face. According to summaries, Homer tells a joke at this part, but it isn't audible in the version I saw. You can't tell what Homer is saying. The view zoomed out as the episode came to a close. The tombstones in the background had names of every Simpsons guest star on them. Some that no one heard of in 1989. Some I haven't heard of since. All of them had death dates on it. For guests who died like Michael Jackson and George Harrison, the dates were when they would actually die. The credits were completely silent and seemed handwritten. The final image was the Simpson family on their couch, like in the intros, but all drawn in hyper-realistic, lifeless style of Bart's corpse. A thought occurred to me after seeing the episode for the first time. You could try to use the tombstones to predict the death of living Simpsons guest stars, but there is something odd about all the stars who haven't died yet. All of their deaths are listed on the same date.